The ground trembles beneath their bare feet. In the distance, the mountain god awakens with a roar that splits the sky in half. Orange flames dance against the darkening horizon as ash begins to rain like black snow upon the primitive world. She is a female Homo habilis named Kira, and today, everything she has ever known will burn. The acrid smell of sulfur fills her nostrils as she clutches her infant son to her chest. Her family of hunters, who have survived ice ages and predator attacks, now face their greatest enemy yet, the earth itself, angry and unforgiving. Behind her, the volcano erupts in a symphony of destruction. Ahead lies only the unknown darkness of a world without shelter, without safety, without hope. But Kira will not let her bloodline die today. The chase for survival begins now, in a time when humans were nothing more than prey, and the planet itself had become the ultimate predator. The first tremor struck just as the sun painted the savanna in shades of amber and crimson. Kira felt it through the solace of her feet, a deep, unsettling vibration that made her bones ache with an ancient fear she couldn't name. She stood at the edge of their temporary camp, scanning the horizon with eyes that had learned to read danger in every shadow. The tall grasses swayed without wind, and the usual chorus of insects had fallen silent. Even the hyenas, those persistent scavengers that followed their hunting party, had vanished into the growing darkness. Something's wrong, she whispered to herself, her rough hands instinctively moving to the stone tools hanging from her hide belt. Behind her, the fire crackled weakly. Her mate Thak crouched beside it, sharpening his spear with methodical precision. Their 3 children huddled close to the flames, her infant son Moro nursing quietly at her breast, while her older children, Zara and Locke, played with animal bones in the dying light. The second tremor was stronger. The water in their crude containers rippled in perfect circles, and somewhere in the distance, rocks tumbled down unseen cliffs with hollow echoes that seemed to come from the earth's very heart. Thak's scarred face lifted toward her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight like those of a predator. "We should move," he said, his voice barely above a growl. "The mountain spirits are restless." Kira nodded, but her gaze remained fixed on the northern horizon, where a strange orange glow had begun to pulse behind the rocky peaks. She had lived through 27 brutal seasons, had seen lightning split trees in half and floods wash away entire herds. But this felt different. This felt final. "Gather everything," she commanded her older children in their primitive tongue, a mixture of grunts, clicks, and gestures that carried the weight of survival. "We leave now." But as Zara and Locke scrambled to collect their meager possessions, the third tremor struck with the force of an angry god. The ground bucked beneath their feet like a wild animal, sending Kira stumbling forward. The fire scattered in a shower of sparks, and their carefully arranged shelter of branches and animal hides collapsed in a tangle of chaos. Moro began to wail a piercing cry that cut through the sudden roar of wind and rumbling earth. Kira pressed him closer to her chest, her maternal instincts screaming even as her survival training kicked in. That's when she saw it. On the horizon, the mountain that had watched over their people for generations began to glow like a massive ember. Orange light poured from its peak, growing brighter with each heartbeat, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with heat that shouldn't exist in the cooling evening. "Look!" She screamed, but her mate was already moving, his powerful frame silhouetted against the chaos as he hefted their heaviest spears. Then came the sound, a roar so deep and terrible that it seemed to originate from the core of the world itself. It rolled across the savanna like thunder that refused to end, growing louder and more furious with each passing moment. The mountain god was awakening, and it was hungry. The world exploded in fire and darkness. Kira had seen lightning strikes, had witnessed the terrifying beauty of prairie fires that consumed everything in their path, but nothing had prepared her for this. The mountain didn't simply erupt, it screamed. A column of molten rock and ash blasted skyward, so high it seemed to pierce the very heavens. The orange glow she had noticed earlier was now a blazing pillar of destruction that turned night into a hellish mockery of day. The sound was beyond comprehension, a continuous roar that made her teeth ache and her bones vibrate. "Run!" Thak's voice was barely audible above the volcanic symphony, but his meaning was clear. He grabbed Zara's hand while Locke clung to his leg, both children's faces frozen in terror. But where could they run? The eruption lit up the entire northern horizon, and already Kira could see something far worse than lava approaching, a wall of ash and debris racing toward them across the savanna like a living thing, devouring everything in its path. The pyroclastic flow moved faster than any animal she had ever seen. Faster than the cheetahs that hunted in the morning light, faster than the panic-stricken herds during a lightning storm. It rolled and tumbled across the landscape, a gray-black tsunami of superheated death that left nothing but devastation in its wake. "The caves!" Kira shouted, pointing toward a rocky outcropping to the south. The deep caves near the water. It was their only chance. The limestone caves they had used for shelter during the worst storms might protect them from the immediate fury of the eruption if they could reach them in time. Thak scooped up Locke and began running, his powerful legs carrying him across the uneven ground with the desperate grace of the hunted. Kira followed, clutching Morrow to her chest with one arm while Zara gripped her free hand. Behind them, the world continued to end. Chunks of molten rock began falling from the sky like deadly rain. Some were small, no bigger than her fist, but they hissed and sparked when they struck the dry grass, immediately igniting small fires that spread with alarming speed. Others were massive boulders of liquid stone that crashed to earth with impacts that shook the ground and sent up geysers of dirt and flame. One landed just 20 paces to their left, and Kira felt the heat wash over them like the breath of some impossible predator. The grass around the impact site burst into flame instantly, adding to the growing inferno that was consuming their world. "Mama!" Zara cried, stumbling as another tremor nearly sent them all sprawling. "Mama, I can't breathe!" The ash was beginning to fall, now not the gentle gray snowfall Kira had imagined, but a choking, burning cascade of pulverized rock and volcanic glass. Each breath felt like swallowing fire, and her eyes streamed with tears that only made the pain worse. Morrow had stopped crying. The infant was unnaturally quiet, his tiny body limp against her chest in a way that sent spikes of pure terror through her heart. Was he unconscious from the ash? Was he ... She couldn't think about that. Not now. Not while they still had a chance. The caves were closer now, dark mouths in the limestone cliff that promised safety or at least a slower death than what pursued them across the burning savanna. But the pyroclastic flow was gaining ground, its leading edge now close enough that she could feel the incredible heat on her back. No. Thak reached the cave entrance first and immediately began pushing his children inside. "Deeper!" he shouted back to Kira. "We need to go deeper." But as she stumbled toward the cave mouth, gasping for breath that wouldn't come, Kira looked back one final time at the world they were leaving behind. The entire northern horizon was ablaze. What had been rolling hills and scattered acacia trees just hours ago was now a hellscape of fire and ash. And still the mountain god roared its fury, sending fresh torrents of destruction racing across the land. They had survived ice ages and droughts, predators and plagues. But this might be the end of everything. The cave swallowed them in blessed darkness, but the reprieve was temporary. Even here, 50 paces underground, the air burned their lungs and the walls trembled with each volcanic convulsion. Kira pressed deeper into the limestone tunnel, following the rough stone walls with her free hand while her family stumbled ahead. The cave system was more extensive than she had remembered. a labyrinth of passages carved by ancient waters that had long since found other paths to the sea. "Stop," Dak commanded suddenly, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Listen." They froze in the absolute darkness, and Kira became aware of a sound that made her blood run cold. Water. Not the gentle dripping of cave moisture, but the angry rush of a flood somewhere deep in the stone maze around them. "The underground river is rising," she whispered, understanding immediately. The volcanic activity was disrupting everything: the water table, the natural drainage patterns, even the ancient courses that had carved these tunnels over countless generations. Behind them, the cave entrance glowed with an evil orange light as the pyroclastic flow finally reached their refuge. The superheated gas and ash poured into the outer chambers like liquid fire, and Kira could hear the rocks themselves beginning to crack and split from the incredible temperature. "We go deeper," Thak decided, though his voice carried the weight of a man who knew he was making a choice between different forms of death. "The water or the fire, at least with water. We have a chance." They pressed on through passages that grew narrower with each turn. Zara whimpered in the darkness, and Locke's breathing had taken on a ragged quality that spoke of lungs struggling with volcanic ash. But it was Morrow's continued silence that gnawed at Kira's sanity with each step. She couldn't check on him properly in the absolute blackness of the deep cave. Couldn't see if his tiny chest was still rising and falling. Couldn't know if she was carrying a living child or... She pushed the thought away and focused on the rough limestone beneath her feet. The sound of rushing water grew louder. Soon they could feel moisture in the air, not the dry, burning heat of the volcanic ash, but the cool dampness of an underground river in full flood. Around a final bend, they emerged into a larger chamber where phosphorescent minerals provided just enough light to see. What they saw was both salvation and doom. An underground lake stretched away into the darkness, fed by multiple channels that poured water into the chamber with increasing violence. The volcanic activity above had disrupted the entire aquifer, turning what had probably been a peaceful subterranean pool into a raging torrent. But the water level was rising fast already, lapping at formations that showed decades of accumulated mineral deposits far above the current surface. This chamber would flood completely within hours, maybe less. "We can swim," Zara said hopefully, her young voice echoing off the wet stone walls. Kira shook her head grimly. "Look at the current. Look at how fast it's moving." The water wasn't just rising. It was being driven by incredible pressure from underground sources. Anyone who entered that flood would be swept away instantly, smashed against submerged rocks or drowned in the chaos of competing currents. "Then we wait," Thak said with the fatalistic calm of a man who had faced death before. "We climb as high as we can and wait for the waters to find their level." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all they had. Working together in the dim phosphorescent light, they scrambled up the sloping walls of the chamber to a ledge that sat perhaps 15 feet above the current water level. There, in a space barely wide enough for them all to sit, they made their desperate stand against the forces that seemed determined to end their bloodline. Kira finally allowed herself to examine Morrow in the ghostly light. Her infant son was alive but unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular from the volcanic ash he had inhaled. She cleaned his tiny nostrils as best she could with the hem of her hide garment and felt a surge of fierce protectiveness that burned hotter than the pyroclastic flow they had escaped. "He'll live," she whispered to herself as much as to the others. "We'll all live." But even as she spoke the words, the water continued to rise, and somewhere far above, the mountain god continued its rampage across the world they had known. The real test was just beginning. Hours passed in the phosphorescent gloom, measured by the relentless rise of the underground flood. What had begun as a torrent pouring through multiple channels had evolved into something far more terrifying, a systematic drowning of their refuge. Kira watched the water climb the chamber walls with the methodical persistence of a stalking predator. The mineral formations that had accumulated over decades now disappeared beneath the surface one by one, like the fingers of the earth itself being consumed. 15 feet above the original water level had seemed safe when they first climbed to their precarious ledge. Now only 5 feet of airspace remained between the rising flood and the chamber's ceiling. "It's not going to stop," Thak said quietly, his words barely audible above the continuous roar of water pouring through the caves. "The whole aquifer is being pushed up by the volcanic pressure." Morrow stirred weakly in Kira's arms, his tiny lungs struggling with each breath. The air in the chamber had become thick and humid, heavy with moisture that made breathing difficult even for healthy adults. For an infant already compromised by volcanic ash, it was becoming a slow torture. There, Zara pointed suddenly to a dark opening high in the chamber wall, perhaps 20 feet above their current position. Another tunnel. Kira squinted through the dim phosphorescent light and felt her heart sink. The opening was there, but reaching it would require climbing across smooth, wet limestone while carrying an infant and helping 2 other children. One slip would mean plunging into the raging flood below. But as if to emphasize their lack of options, the water rose another 6 inches while she watched. 4.5 feet of breathing space remained. "I go first," Thak decided, already studying the treacherous path up the chamber wall. "Test the holds, find the safest route." He moved with the careful precision of a man who understood that haste meant death. Each handhold was tested twice, each footstep placed with deliberate care on stone that gleamed with treacherous moisture. The phosphorescent minerals provided just enough light to see the general shapes of the rock face, but the shadows between could hide loose stones or crumbling edges. 20 feet had never seemed so far. Halfway up, a piece of limestone broke away beneath his foot, sending him swinging by his arms over the flood below. For a heart-stopping moment, Kira thought she was watching her mate fall to his death. But Thak held on, found new perches for his feet, and continued climbing. When he finally pulled himself into the upper tunnel, his voice echoed down with cautious optimism. "It goes back. There's air movement, away to the surface." But getting the children up would be another challenge entirely. Working together, they devised a desperate plan. Using strips torn from their hide clothing and woven grass that Zara had collected earlier, they fashioned a crude rope system. Thak would pull from above while Kira guided and supported from below. Locke went first, his 8-year-old body light enough that the improvised rope could support his weight. He climbed with the natural fearlessness of youth, following the exact path his father had taken. When strong hands pulled him to safety in the upper tunnel, Kira felt her first moment of genuine hope since the eruption began. Zara was next, older and heavier but also more careful. She tested each hold as she had seen her father do, moving with deliberate caution across the treacherous limestone face. The makeshift rope supported her weight, and soon she too disappeared into the darkness above. But Morrow presented an impossible problem. How could Kira climb 20 feet of wet stone while carrying an unconscious infant? How could she maintain the precise grip and balance required when one arm was occupied protecting her son? The water answered her dilemma by rising another foot. 3.5 feet of air remained. "Bind him to your back," Thak called down. "Use the rope as a harness." It was their only option. With trembling fingers, Kira fashioned a crude but secure harness that held Morrow tightly against her back. The infant's breathing had grown even more labored, but he was still alive, still fighting. The climb was a nightmare of concentration and terror. Every movement had to account for the precious cargo on her back. Every handhold tested not just for her own safety, but for the helpless child who depended on her. The wet limestone seemed to mock her efforts, providing purchase one moment and threatening to crumble the next. Halfway up, her fingers began to cramp. The constant tension, the humidity, The sheer physical demands of the climb were taking their toll. Below her, the water continued its relentless rise, now only 3 feet from the chamber ceiling. "Almost there?" Thak's voice encouraged her. 10 more feet. But 10 feet might as well have been 100. Her muscles screamed with exhaustion, and Morrow's weight seemed to double with each movement. The makeshift rope cut into her waist where it supported part of her weight, and her feet kept slipping on the moisture-slicked stone. Then, just as her strength began to fail, strong hands grasped her wrists. Thak hauled both her and Morrow into the upper tunnel with a desperate surge of power that spoke of a man saving his family through pure will. They collapsed together on the tunnel floor, gasping in the relatively dry air, while behind them the water claimed the chamber they had abandoned. Within minutes, the phosphorescent glow was completely submerged, and their former refuge became just another flooded section of the cave system. But they weren't safe yet. The tunnel ahead stretched into absolute darkness, and somewhere far above, the world still burned. The tunnel climbed steadily upward through the limestone, a natural chimney carved by ancient waters seeking the surface. But with each step, the air grew warmer, and an ominous orange glow began to flicker ahead of them, not the gentle phosphorescence of the cave minerals, but the angry light of a world on fire. Kira adjusted Morrow's position on her back, noting with growing concern that his breathing had become even more shallow and irregular. The infant needed clean air, proper warmth, and care that she couldn't provide in these underground passages. But the alternative, returning to the surface while the volcanic eruption continued, might kill them all within minutes. "Stop," Thak commanded suddenly, holding up a hand for silence. They froze in the narrow tunnel, and gradually Kira became aware of what had alarmed her mate. The sound of wind, but not natural wind. This was the continuous roar of superheated air being displaced by ongoing volcanic violence, punctuated by the crash of debris and the distant rumble of pyroclastic flows. The surface was close, but it remained a hellscape. "We can't go back," she whispered, thinking of the flooded chambers below. "The water will have filled everything by now. And we can't stay here," Zara added, her young voice tight with fear. The tunnel walls were growing noticeably warmer as they climbed, heated by the volcanic activity above. Thak moved carefully toward the growing orange glow ahead, motioning for the others to stay back. When he returned a few minutes later, his face was grim in the firelight. "The tunnel opens onto a hillside," he reported. "We're about halfway up the slope, maybe 200 paces above the floodplain. But ... double quote." He paused, struggling with how to describe what he had seen. "The world is ending," he said finally. "Fire everywhere. The air burns to breathe. Rocks falling from the sky like rain." But even as he spoke, they could all feel the tunnel walls growing hotter. The limestone was beginning to conduct heat from the surface, turning their refuge into a slowly heating oven. They would have to make a choice: soon risk the surface inferno or cook slowly in the depths. "How long until dawn?" Kira asked, though in truth she had lost all sense of time in the underground darkness. "Hours yet," Thak replied, "but the mountain god doesn't sleep. It will burn until it chooses to rest, whether the sun rises or not." Morrow stirred weakly against her back, making a small sound that might have been a cry if he had possessed the strength. The decision crystallized in Kira's mind with sudden clarity. "We go up," she said firmly. "Now, while we still have the strength to run if we need to. My son needs clean air, even if that air is full of ash." It was a mother's choice, driven by instinct older than civilization itself. Her child was dying slowly in the depths, so they would face the fire above and either live or die together under the open sky. The final climb was a journey through gradually increasing hell. With each step upward, the air grew hotter and more difficult to breathe. The walls of the tunnel began to radiate heat like the sides of a fire pit, and loose stones fell more frequently as the volcanic activity continued to shake the earth. But it was the sound that truly prepared them for what they would find above, a continuous symphony of destruction that grew louder with each footstep. The roar of wind and flame, the crash of falling debris, the deeper rumble of pyroclastic flows racing across the devastated landscape. When they finally reached the tunnel mouth, the sight that greeted them was beyond anything their primitive minds had conceived possible. The world was painted in shades of orange and black. Where once rolling savanna had stretched to the horizon, now a landscape of fire and ash extended in every direction. The few trees that still stood were burning torches against the nightmare sky, and the ground itself seemed to glow with residual heat from the volcanic bombardment. But most terrifying of all was the mountain itself. What had been a familiar landmark on their northern horizon was now a blazing wound in the earth, continuously vomiting forth torrents of molten rock and ash that painted the sky in hellish colors. "We can't survive out there," Locke whispered, his young voice barely audible above the volcanic roar. But Kira was already moving, driven by maternal instinct and the knowledge that staying in the increasingly hot tunnel meant certain death. She stepped out onto the scorched hillside, shielding Morrow's face from the falling ash, and began searching for any sign of hope in the burning world. That's when she saw them distant figures moving across the hellscape to the south. Other survivors, perhaps members of their extended clan, fleeing through the same nightmare that threatened to consume them all. "There," she pointed through the ash-filled air. "Others live. Others run." It wasn't much, but it was enough. If other humans could survive in this volcanic wasteland, then perhaps her family could as well. The surface beckoned, not with promises of safety, but with the chance to die fighting rather than suffocating slowly in the depths. The surface world had become an alien landscape where survival depended on reading the rhythm of destruction itself. Kira learned quickly that the volcanic bombardment came in waves periods of intense activity followed by brief respites when the mountain gods seemed to pause for breath. During one such lull, they made their desperate dash across the scorched hillside. The ground beneath their feet was still warm from the pyroclastic flows that had passed hours earlier, and every step sent up small puffs of ash that stung their eyes and burned their throats. Morrow had regained consciousness, but his cries were weak and punctuated by coughing fits that terrified her. "The river," Thak gasped, pointing toward a dark line that cut across the burning savanna. "If we can reach the water, ... It was their best hope. Rivers might provide some protection from the falling ash, and the moisture could help them breathe more easily. But between their current position and that distant promise of relief lay nearly a mile of volcanic wasteland. They ran when the bombardment lessened, taking shelter behind rocks or in shallow depressions when fresh waves of debris began falling from the angry sky. The larger chunks of molten rock gave some warning. They glowed like fallen stars as they arced through the ash-filled air, but the smaller fragments fell like deadly rain with no warning at all. Halfway to the river, disaster struck. A massive boulder of superheated volcanic rock crashed to earth just 50 paces ahead of them, exploding on impact and sending razor-sharp fragments spraying in all directions. One piece, no larger than her thumb, struck Zara in the thigh and sent her sprawling with a scream of pain. "Mama!" the girl cried, clutching her leg as blood seeped between her fingers. "It burns! It burns!" The volcanic fragment had not just cut her. It had cauterized the wound with heat that seared flesh like a brand. Zara was alive, but she couldn't run. Not with a leg wound that made every step agony. "Leave me," the girl gasped with the stoic courage that came naturally to those born in a brutal world. "Take the others and run." But Kira was already kneeling beside her daughter, examining the wound with experienced eyes. The cut was deep, but not fatal, and the heat had sealed most of the bleeding. Zara could survive if they could all survive. "Thak," she commanded without looking up. "Carry her. I'll manage Morrow." Her mate didn't argue. In one smooth motion, he lifted Zara onto his back, positioning her so that her injured leg wouldn't drag on the ground. The girl bit back cries of pain as the movement jostled her wound, but she wrapped her arms around her father's neck and held on. They continued their desperate journey toward the river, now moving more slowly but still making progress. The ashfall had lessened somewhat, though the air remained thick and difficult to breathe. In the distance, other groups of survivors could be seen making similar desperate flights across the transformed landscape. When they finally reached the riverbank, what they found was both salvation and horror. The water ran black with ash and debris, choked with the detritus of the volcanic devastation upstream. But it was still water, still cooler than the burning air, still their best chance of survival. Other survivors had had the same idea, perhaps 30 humans huddled along the muddy banks, their faces streaked with ash and their eyes hollow with shock. Among them, Kira recognized faces from their extended clan. Grok, the old toolmaker, whose hands had shaped more spear points than anyone could count. Vera, the medicine woman who knew which plants could heal and which could kill. Young Tam, barely older than Zara, clutching an infant who might have been his brother. They were the remnants of their people, all that remained of generations that had survived ice ages and predators, plagues and floods, only to face this ultimate test. "The mountain god is angry," Grok said as they joined the bedraggled group. His voice carried the weight of his many seasons, but also a resignation that chilled Kira more than the volcanic ash. "Perhaps we have taken too much from the earth. Perhaps this is our punishment." But Vera, the medicine woman, shook her head firmly. "The earth changes as it always has. We adapt or we die. That is the way it has always been." She examined Zara's wound with expert hands, cleaning it as best she could with the muddy river water and binding it with strips of hide. The girl would live, though she would bear the scar of this day for the rest of her life. As for Morrow, the medicine woman's prognosis was cautiously optimistic. "His lungs are strong," she pronounced after listening to his breathing. "The ash will pass through him in time, but he needs clean air and rest." Clean air seemed impossible in their current world, but rest that they could provide. As the volcanic activity began to lessen with the coming of dawn, the exhausted survivors settled along the riverbank to wait. They had survived the worst night in human memory. The mountain god's fury was far from spent, but it had moved on to devastate other parts of their world. Here, beside the ash-choked river, they could breathe and plan and hope. But as Kira looked north toward the still glowing peak that had nearly destroyed them all, she knew that their world had changed forever. The familiar landmarks were gone, buried under layers of ash and molten rock. The hunting grounds they had known since childhood were now alien wasteland. They would have to find new places to live, new sources of food and water, new ways to survive in a transformed world. It would be the greatest challenge their species had ever faced. Yet, as she watched Morrow's breathing gradually grow stronger and felt Zara's hand squeeze hers with returning vitality, Kira felt something that surprised her, not just relief, but pride. They had faced the fury of the earth itself and emerged alive. They had carried their bloodline through the fire and ash, ensuring that the human story would continue despite the mountain god's rage. The sun rose on a blackened world, but it rose on a world where humans still drew breath. And as long as they lived, they would adapt, survive, and ultimately thrive. The age of fire was ending. The age of recovery was about to begin. But in the distance, other mountains watched with ancient eyes, and Kira couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the first test of many to come.